The streetlights flickered against the dark Los Angeles skyline as Elon Musk's Tesla inched through a quiet back alley. His meetings had run late, again, and his mind swirled with calculations, deadlines, and ambitious plans for humanity's future. As his driver waited for a red light to change, Elon's attention was drawn to a figure slumped against a brick wall, barely illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby diner sign. The man's clothes were threadbare, his face gaunt, with lines etched deep from years of hardship. His cardboard sign read, "I had it all once too." Elon blinked, his brow furrowing. The word struck a nerve. A man who once had everything? What could have led him here? "Sir," his driver asked, noticing his pause, "should I keep moving?" For a moment, Elon said nothing, torn between his instincts to stay detached and a sudden, gnawing curiosity. He thought of all the times he had stared down failure, clawing his way back from the brink. What if, in some twist of fate, this man's path could have been his? "No, wait," Elon said finally, his voice firm. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Sir, it's not safe," the driver protested. But Elon was already stepping out of the car, his shoes crunching against the pavement as he approached the man. The smell of the city, oil, trash, and faintly of rain, clung to the air. The man looked up, his eyes weary but sharp. He pulled his tattered jacket closer, as if preparing for another dismissal or judgment. "Do you mind if I sit?" Elon asked, gesturing to the curb. The man frowned, puzzled. "You want to sit here?" Elon nodded. He lowered himself to the ground without waiting for an answer, the cold biting through his tailored suit. The two sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city around them. Finally, Elon spoke, his voice low and even. "What happened to you?" The man's lips twitched, almost as if he wanted to laugh. "Why would you care?" Elon leaned back, glancing at the sign again. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything. And because, in another life, this could have been me." The man's eyes narrowed, studying Elon's face as if trying to place him. Recognition flickered. "You're that guy. The space guy. Tesla. Elon Musk, right?" Elon gave a small nod. "That's me. And you are?" The man hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Paul. Paul Manning." "Well, Paul," Elon said, his tone serious, "why don't you tell me your story?" The man stared at him, distrust and intrigue warring in his expression. After a long pause, he exhaled deeply, his voice rough but steady. "Fine, but don't expect some sob story. This ain't one of your sci-fi scripts. It's just life. Messy, unfair, and cruel." And with that, Paul began to speak, his words pulling Elon, and perhaps even himself, into the tangled wreckage of a life that had once soared high but now lay in ruins. What would you do if you saw someone like Paul? Would you stop? Would you listen? Share your thoughts below. As Paul's raspy voice filled the chilly night air, Elon couldn't help but think back to the moments in his own life where everything seemed to hang by a thread. For a man celebrated as one of the world's greatest innovators, those moments were surprisingly frequent. Elon had always been the kind of person to chase impossible dreams. First, PayPal, his entry into the tech world. Then Tesla, an audacious gamble that many predicted would fail. And of course, SpaceX, the company that redefined humanity's relationship with the stars. What people rarely saw was the sheer weight of it all. The countless sleepless nights. The times when his companies teetered on the edge of collapse. He remembered 2008, a year that felt like a living nightmare. Tesla was burning through cash, and SpaceX had suffered 3 rocket launch failures in a row. The media painted him as a reckless dreamer, a man too arrogant to know when to quit. Investors were pulling out. Personal relationships strained under the pressure. And then there was that day. The day he'd stood in his cramped office, staring at the grim numbers on a spreadsheet. Bankruptcy was no longer a vague threat. It was an almost certain reality. He had 2 choices: divide the remaining funds between Tesla and SpaceX, knowing both might fail, or choose one and let the other die. Elon had gambled it all. He poured every last cent he had into his companies, leaving himself virtually broke. Everyone told him he was crazy, but he had survived. Barely. Even now, as he sat on a grimy curb in Los Angeles. The echoes of that time still haunted him. He could almost feel the phantom weight of the pressure that once pressed down on his chest. "What's with the look?" Paul's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp with a mix of suspicion and irritation. Elon blinked, realizing his face had betrayed his thoughts. "Just thinking." "Must be nice," Paul muttered, his tone cutting. "Thinking from the top of your empire. Must be real easy to look down here and feel inspired, or whatever." Elon shook his head. "You think it's all easy?" Paul gave a bitter laugh. "For you? Yeah. Money, fame, power. You've got it all. People like you don't end up like this." Elon hesitated, the urge to argue bubbling up. But instead, he asked, "Do you think that's what defines me? Money and power?" Paul didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at his own trembling hands. "It's what the world sees. Isn't that enough?" The question hung heavy in the air. For years, Elon had tried to prove the world wrong, to show that he wasn't just another billionaire chasing profits, that his ambition had purpose. But sitting here, facing a man like Paul, he wondered if that message ever truly landed. "No," Elon said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not enough. And it's not the full story." Paul scoffed. "And what is? A motivational poster? Some feel-good line about never giving up?" Elon leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The full story is that I've been where you are, at least in my own way. I've been broke, mocked, written off as a failure. The only difference is, I got a second chance." Paul's lips pressed into a thin line, skepticism still etched on his face. "Yeah, well, second chances are for people who can afford to take risks. Not guys like me." But even as Paul said the words, something in his voice softened, just enough for Elon to notice. "You're wrong about that," Elon said. "Second chances aren't given. They're made. And I have a feeling you're not as done as you think you are." Paul fell silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decipher Elon's sincerity. He didn't know it yet, but this conversation was about to become the catalyst for something neither of them could predict. "Do you believe in second chances? What would you do if life gave you one? Let us know your thoughts below." Paul stared at Elon for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back against the cold, graffiti-covered wall and exhaled deeply. "You want my story? Fine," Paul said, his voice rough. "But don't expect some Hollywood redemption tale. It's just life. And life's a bastard." Elon nodded silently, waiting for him to begin. "I wasn't always this," Paul said, gesturing to his worn clothes and the crumpled sign beside him. "I had a good life once. Hell, a great life. A house in the suburbs, a wife who loved me, and a little girl who thought I was her hero." Paul's voice softened at the mention of his daughter, a brief flicker of warmth in his otherwise cold tone. "Her name's Lily. She be 15 now." Elon noticed the subtle change in Paul's demeanor, the way his hand twitched slightly as if reaching for a memory. "What happened?" Paul let out a bitter laugh. "What didn't?" "It started with my company. A little tech startup. I called it StreamSync. We were trying to revolutionize how people stored and accessed data. Back then, cloud computing was just starting to take off, and I thought I had the next big thing." For the first time, Paul's voice carried a spark of pride. "We were good. No, we were great. Investors were lining up. Tech blogs were calling us the next big disruptor. And me? I thought I was untouchable." Paul's smile faded, replaced by a hardened look. "But pride's a funny thing. Makes you blind to the knives at your back." Elon tilted his head, intrigued. "What happened?" "My co-founder, Mark. We've been friends since college. He was the numbers guy. I was the visionary. Or at least, that's how I saw it." Paul's jaw tightened. "Turns out, Mark saw it differently. He started cutting deals behind my back, pushing me out of the company we built together. I didn't see it until it was too late." Paul's voice grew colder, his words clipped. "One day, I walked into the office and security stopped me. Said my badge didn't work. An hour later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, reading through papers that said I'd been removed as CEO. Mark had convinced the board I was unstable, a liability. Elon frowned. You didn't fight it? Paul shrugged. I tried. But Mark had the money, the connections. And I had nothing. By the time it was over, the company was his, and I was a pariah in the tech world. No one wanted to touch me. My reputation was shot. Paul's voice cracked slightly, and he looked away. Losing the company was bad enough. But it didn't stop there. My wife, Sarah, she tried to stick it out. She really did. But I wasn't exactly easy to live with after that. I drank too much, yelled too much, pushed her away. One day, she packed her things and left. Took Lily with her. For a moment, Paul seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant. I tried to pull myself together, to get them back. But every door I knocked on was slammed in my face. Eventually, I just stopped trying. And here I am. Elon studied Paul, his mind racing. He could see the pain in the man's eyes, the weight of years of regret and bitterness. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something that hadn't been entirely snuffed out. You're not done, Elon said quietly. Paul snorted. Yeah, sure. You gonna wave a magic wand and fix everything? Newsflash, Musk. Life doesn't work like that. No, Elon replied, his voice steady. It doesn't. But sometimes, it gives you a chance to start over. The question is, are you ready to take it? Paul shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. You don't get it. Some things, you can't come back from. Elon leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Maybe not, but you can move forward. And if you're willing to try, I'll help. Paul stared at him, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, a small ember of hope flickered within him, though he wouldn't admit it, not yet. What would you do if someone offered you a second chance? Would you take it, or would fear hold you back? Share your thoughts below. Paul squinted at Elon, suspicion etched into every line on his weathered face. Help? What does that even mean coming from a guy like you? Gonna throw some cash at me, pat yourself on the back, and call it charity? Elon shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I don't do charity. I do investments. If I help you, it's because I see potential. Paul's laugh was bitter. Potential? In this? He gestured at himself, his tattered clothes and the grimy surroundings. You're either blind or crazy. Maybe both, Elon said, his tone light but his eyes serious. But I've bet on crazier things before. What's the harm in one more? Paul leaned back, folding his arms defensively. What's the catch? No catch, Elon said simply. Just one condition. If I help you, you have to actually try. No quitting halfway. No wallowing in self-pity. Deal? Paul scoffed. And what exactly does help look like? You think you can just buy my way out of this mess? Money isn't the solution, Elon replied. At least, not by itself. What you need is a plan and a reason to follow it. Paul looked at him, his skepticism unwavering. And you think you've got all the answers, huh? Elon shook his head. No, but I've got resources, connections, and a lot of experience with turning disaster into opportunity. The rest is up to you. For a moment, Paul said nothing. The distant sound of car horns and footsteps filled the silence. Finally, he exhaled sharply. All right, say I'm crazy enough to go along with this. Where do we even start? Elon's smile was faint but genuine. First, we figure out what you're still good at. You had the drive to build a company once. That doesn't just disappear. Paul's gaze dropped to the ground. That was a long time ago. Doesn't matter, Elon said firmly. Skills can be sharpened, but you have to want it. Paul ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his mind racing. It had been years since he'd thought about anything other than survival. The idea of starting over felt impossible. And yet, something about Elon's calm confidence made it seem almost plausible. You really think I can pull this off? Paul asked, his voice quieter now. I don't think, Elon replied. I know, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Paul stared at him, his jaw tightening. Part of him wanted to dismiss this whole conversation as a billionaire's passing whim, a PR stunt, or a fleeting act of pity. But another part, the part that used to dream big, The part that refused to give up even when things got tough, was tempted to believe. "All right," Paul said finally, his voice gruff. "I'll bite. But if this is some kind of game, I'm out." "No games," Elon assured him. "Just a chance. And I don't waste chances." Paul nodded slowly, a flicker of determination lighting his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. "Would you take a chance on rebuilding your life, even if it seemed impossible? What would motivate you to try? Let us know your thoughts below." The next morning, Paul awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of purpose. The dawn's light filtered through the jagged skyline of downtown Los Angeles, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He didn't know what to expect from Elon Musk's so-called offer, but the thought of doing something, anything, felt like a lifeline. True to his word, Elon was waiting. He stood a short distance from Paul's makeshift shelter, dressed in his usual understated style, dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Beside him was a sleek electric SUV, its quiet hum almost imperceptible as it idled at the curb. Paul approached cautiously, his defenses still up. "This feels weird," he admitted. Elon smirked. "Good. Change always does." With little fanfare, they climbed into the car. The interior was immaculate, almost clinical in its minimalism. Paul couldn't help but feel out of place as he settled into the plush leather seat, his worn clothes a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings. "So," Paul began hesitantly, "where are we going?" "To figure out your next move," Elon replied, tapping the touchscreen on the dashboard. "First stop, food. Can't plan on an empty stomach." They pulled into a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The place was unassuming, a mom-and-pop establishment with checkered tablecloths and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee. Paul hesitated at the door, his self-consciousness kicking in. "Relax," Elon said, gesturing for Paul to follow. "Nobody's judging you here." Over eggs and toast, the conversation turned to Paul's past. Elon listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes on a sleek tablet. Marcus and Clara sprinted down the hallway, Nate close behind. Clara's mind was spinning, the world around her moving too fast. Betrayed by the man she had loved, hunted by people she didn't understand, and with the truth just out of reach. How had everything gone so wrong? "All right," Paul muttered to himself, "let's see what's under the hood." As he dove deeper, he identified a bottleneck in one of the automation processes. It wasn't critical, but it slowed down a specific set of robotic tasks by a fraction of a second, a delay that would add up significantly over time in large-scale operations. Paul's fingers moved more confidently now, analyzing the inefficiency. His mind clicked into problem-solving mode, piecing together a solution. Within an hour, he'd rewritten a segment of the code, optimizing the task allocation system. He ran a simulation to test his changes. The results were immediate, a 12% increase in efficiency for the affected process. "Not bad for an old dog," Paul murmured, allowing himself a small smile. Elon's voice startled Paul out of his concentration. "Found anything interesting?" Paul looked up, unsure how to answer. "Just a minor inefficiency in the automation flow. Cleaned it up." Elon nodded, glancing at Paul's screen. "Good start. But let's raise the stakes." He tapped a few commands into his tablet, and a new interface appeared on Paul's monitor, a live feed of data from a renewable energy system. "This is one of our experimental solar farms. We've been trying to improve energy storage efficiency, but we keep hitting diminishing returns. Think you can take a crack at it?" Paul blinked. "You're serious?" "Why wouldn't I be?" Elon replied. "You said you wanted to prove yourself. Here's your chance." Paul hesitated, the scale of the problem daunting. But he pushed the fear aside and began analyzing the data. The system was impressively complex, a delicate interplay of hardware and software. He could see why they were struggling. Any small change had cascading effects across the entire network. Hours passed as Paul worked. He dug into energy distribution algorithms, tweaking parameters and testing new models. At one point, he hit a wall, the simulation crashing repeatedly. Frustration bubbled up, but he refused to give up. "You all right over there?" a voice asked. Paul turned to see a young engineer watching him curiously. "Yeah," Paul replied, forcing a grin. Just shaking off the rust. The engineer smiled. Well, if you need a second pair of eyes, let me know. This place can be a lot at first. Paul nodded, appreciating the offer but determined to figure it out on his own. By late evening, Paul leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling in equal measure. He devised a new algorithm that redistributed energy loads more dynamically, reducing waste and improving storage efficiency by nearly 8%. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a tangible improvement. Elon returned, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the results. After a long moment, he nodded. Not bad. You still have it. Paul let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's a start. More than a start, Elon said, his tone approving. You just improved a system that some of the brightest minds in the industry have been wrestling with for weeks. That's not nothing. Paul shrugged, though he couldn't suppress a small smile. Guess I've still got a few tricks up my sleeve. As they drove back into the city, Paul stared out the window, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of the old him, the version of himself who thrived on challenges, who believed in the impossible. You did good today, Elon said, breaking the silence. But this is just the beginning. Paul nodded, his gaze steady. I'm ready for whatever's next. When was the last time you faced a challenge that made you rediscover your strengths? Could it be the start of something new? Share your story below. The next morning, Paul woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The sunlight creeping through the blinds of the small apartment Elon had arranged for him felt like a metaphor, illuminating a path forward, even if it was still unfamiliar. His first instinct was to distrust this sudden turn of fortune. How many times had hope betrayed him before? But something about Elon's calm, matter-of-fact belief in his abilities made Paul want to believe too. Elon had given him a week to settle into the rhythm of the experimental workspace. Each morning, Paul arrived at the facility early, coffee in hand, ready to tackle new challenges. The engineers began to warm to him, offering tips and occasionally asking for his input. Paul, initially hesitant, found himself falling into the collaborative flow with surprising ease. He had forgotten how invigorating it was to work alongside others who shared his passion for problem-solving. By midweek, Paul had identified another inefficiency in the automation system. This time, it wasn't just a software issue. It required a hardware adjustment as well. He pitched his idea to the team, and to his surprise, they listened. We'll need to recalibrate the robotic arms, one engineer said thoughtfully. Do it, another chimed in. Paul's algorithm already shaved off downtime. Let's see what this tweak can do. As the team worked together to implement the changes, Paul felt a strange but welcome sensation, belonging. Despite the progress, Paul couldn't completely shake his doubts. Late one night, after most of the team had left, he sat alone in the break room, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. The ghosts of his past loomed large. The memories of his failure, the collapse of his company, the bridges burned. It all threatened to pull him under again. You look like a man wrestling with demons, a familiar voice said. Paul looked up to see Elon standing in the doorway. Something like that, Paul admitted. I keep thinking about how it all went wrong before. What if it happens again? Elon sat across from him, his expression serious. It might. Failure's always a possibility. But here's the thing. You already survived your worst-case scenario. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. That means you're stronger than you think. Paul looked away, his grip tightening around the coffee mug. Easier said than done. Of course it is, Elon replied. But you're not the same person you were back then. You've got experience now. Wisdom. You know what it feels like to fall, and you know how to get back up. Paul sighed, the weight in his chest loosening ever so slightly. I'm just not sure if I can trust myself again. Then trust the process, Elon said simply, and trust the people who see potential in you. The conversation stayed with Paul as he drove home that night. Trusting the process. It sounded so cliché, yet it resonated deeply. Maybe rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to carry it differently. The next day, Paul arrived at the facility with renewed focus. He threw himself into the work, tackling each task with a combination of determination and creativity that hadn't surfaced in years. By the end of the week, Paul had helped streamline a critical aspect of the automation process, reducing overall costs and improving productivity. Elon reviewed the results with the team, his approval evident in his rare but genuine smile. "You're exceeding expectations," Elon said to Paul afterward. "Keep this up, and you'll be leading your own projects before long." Paul's chest tightened, a mix of pride and disbelief. "I'm just glad to be contributing." Elon's gaze was steady. "You're doing more than that. You're proving what I already knew, that you still have what it takes." For the first time in years, Paul allowed himself to believe it might be true. Have you ever doubted yourself, only to find strength you didn't know you had? What helped you overcome those doubts? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the second week, Paul's progress at the facility was undeniable. His name was starting to circulate among the engineers and team leaders as someone who could deliver results. Yet, with success came greater expectations and challenges that tested not just his skills but also his integrity. One afternoon, as Paul was fine-tuning a new optimization model, a man in a tailored suit walked into the lab. He exuded the kind of corporate authority that made the room go quiet. "Paul Winters," the man said, his tone sharp. Paul turned, wary. "That's me. And you are?" "Arthur Blackwell," the man replied, handing Paul a business card. "Director of Business Development at Apex Tech Solutions." Paul's stomach churned. Apex Tech had been one of the companies indirectly responsible for the collapse of his startup. They had undercut his contracts, poached key employees, and spread rumors that his technology was flawed. "What do you want?" Paul asked, his voice colder than he intended. Blackwell smiled, a predatory expression. "To talk. Privately." They stepped into a conference room, the glass walls offering a view of the bustling lab. Blackwell wasted no time. "I've been following your recent work here," he began. "Impressive. It seems you've bounced back nicely." Paul crossed his arms, his defenses up. "Get to the point." Blackwell leaned forward. "Apex Tech could use someone with your skills. We're expanding into automation and renewable energy, and we need visionaries. I'm authorized to offer you a position, senior level, with full creative control over your projects." Paul's jaw tightened. "You must be joking. After everything Apex Tech did to my company?" Blackwell shrugged, unbothered. "Business is business. Besides, you know better than most how brutal this industry can be. Take the offer, and you'll have the resources and platform to achieve everything you once dreamed of, and more." Paul stared at the business card on the table, the Apex Tech logo mocking him. The offer was tempting, but the memory of how Apex Tech had contributed to his downfall burned in his mind. "What's the catch?" Paul asked. Blackwell smirked. "No catch. But if you join us, you'll need to sever ties with Musk Industries. Conflict of interest and all that." Paul's stomach sank. The offer wasn't just a career move. It was a test of loyalty. Later that evening, Paul sat in his apartment, the card still in his hand. He felt torn. Apex Tech's resources could fast-track his comeback, but walking away from Elon's support felt like a betrayal. Unable to make a decision, he decided to call Elon. "What's on your mind?" Elon asked when Paul explained the situation. Paul hesitated. Would it be stupid to consider their offer? They're promising creative control, a big salary, and a chance to lead major projects. It's tempting. Elon didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. "It's not about the money or the position, Paul. It's about your values. Do you trust them? Do you believe they'll let you create something meaningful without strings attached?" Paul thought about Blackwell's smirk, the way he dismissed the past as just business. "I don't trust them," Paul admitted. "Then there's your answer," Elon said simply. "But the choice is yours. Whatever you decide, make sure it aligns with the person you want to be, not just the career you want to have." The next day, Paul returned to the facility with a renewed sense of clarity. Blackwell was waiting for him in the lobby. "Well?" Blackwell asked, his smile thin and expectant. Paul handed the business card back. "Thanks, but no thanks." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Paul said, his voice steady, "but it's my mistake to make." Blackwell turned and left without another word. Word of Paul's decision spread quickly through the facility. Some of the engineers approached him, their respect evident. "You had a lot to gain from that offer," one of them said. "Takes guts to turn it down." Paul shrugged, though the validation warmed him. It just didn't feel right. Later that day, Elon stopped by Paul's workstation. "Good call," Elon said. "Integrity isn't something you can fake. People notice." Paul nodded, a small but genuine smile on his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was rebuilding not just his career but also his character. Have you ever had to make a tough decision that tested your values? How did it shape the person you are today? Let's hear your stories in the comments. Paul's decision to reject Apex Tech's offer brought a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, as the weeks went by, he realized that proving himself wasn't enough. He wanted to make a lasting impact. The projects Elon had him working on were impressive, but Paul yearned for something more personal. One evening, while reviewing performance data for a solar storage system, Paul noticed a recurring issue: power inefficiencies in urban areas with aging infrastructure. The inefficiencies disproportionately affected lower-income neighborhoods, where the grid was most fragile. As he studied the data, a bold idea began to form. What if there were a way to decentralize energy storage for these communities? A modular, affordable solution that could empower individuals while alleviating strain on the main grid. Paul grabbed a notebook and started sketching. The idea wasn't entirely new. Others had dabbled in similar concepts, but Paul envisioned a system that was not only efficient but also scalable and accessible. The next day, Paul requested a meeting with Elon. "An independent project?" Elon asked, leaning back in his chair as Paul explained his concept. "Not independent," Paul clarified. "Integrated. Musk Industries already has the tech to make this work. We can adapt existing energy modules for localized use." Elon stroked his chin thoughtfully. "And what's the goal?" "To bridge the energy gap," Paul said. "Right now, the most vulnerable communities are left behind because they can't afford upgrades. This system would empower them to generate, store, and use their own energy. It's about creating resilience." Elon was silent for a moment, his sharp eyes fixed on Paul. Finally, he nodded. "It's ambitious. I like that. But you'll need to prove it's viable." Paul grinned. "Give me a month." Paul threw himself into the project, working late nights and early mornings. He assembled a small team of engineers who shared his passion for the idea. Together, they brainstormed, designed, and tested. The first prototype was a disaster. The system overheated during testing, frying several components. Frustration rippled through the team, but Paul refused to let it derail them. "Failures are just steps on the way to success," he told them, echoing something Elon had once said to him. "We'll figure it out." By the third iteration, the system was stable. It was a sleek, modular unit that could be installed in a backyard or small apartment, allowing users to collect and store solar energy efficiently. Elon arranged for Paul to present the prototype to a panel of senior engineers and stakeholders. Paul stood in front of the group, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "This isn't just a product," Paul began. "It's a solution, a way to democratize energy access and empower communities that have been left behind." He walked them through the technical specs, the cost analysis, and the projected impact. The room was silent when he finished, the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. Finally, one of the senior engineers spoke. "It's impressive, but scaling this up will be a logistical nightmare." Paul nodded. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, but it's worth the effort. And with Musk Industries' resources, we can make it happen." Elon, who had been quiet throughout the presentation, leaned forward. "Let's do it," he said simply. The decision marked a turning point for Paul. Leading the project wasn't just a professional victory, it was a personal redemption. He was no longer just fixing systems. He was creating something new, something meaningful. As the team began planning the next phase, Paul felt a surge of pride and excitement. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. What's the most ambitious idea you've ever pursued? Did it succeed, or did it teach you something unexpected? Share your journey below. With Elon's approval, Paul's project moved into its next phase, planning for a pilot program in an underserved urban area. However, the challenges that came with such an ambitious undertaking quickly became evident. Beyond technical hurdles, Paul faced bureaucratic red tape, skepticism from potential stakeholders, and even pushback from within the company. Paul, this project is idealistic, sure, but it's a drain on resources, one of the senior engineers argued during a planning meeting. We have more profitable ventures to focus on. Why prioritize this? Another added, scaling these systems for urban use will take years of testing and funding. And let's not forget, the communities you're targeting might not even trust the technology. Paul felt the weight of their words. The doubts were valid. He had thought them himself more than once. But he also knew the stakes. This isn't just about profit, Paul countered. It's about impact. If we succeed, we set a precedent. We show that innovation isn't just for the wealthy, it's for everyone. Despite his conviction, the meeting ended with mixed reactions. Paul couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting. Later that week, as Paul was poring over cost analyses, a knock on the door startled him. It was Clara, one of the engineers who had been silent during the contentious meeting. I wanted to say, I believe in what you're doing, she said. And I think a lot of others do too, even if they're afraid to say it out loud. Paul smiled, grateful for the support. Thanks, Clara. That means a lot. She set a stack of papers on his desk. These are some potential partnerships I've been researching, organizations that might be willing to co-fund or support the pilot program. It's a long shot, but I think it's worth exploring. Paul looked through the list, hope rekindling. You're right. Let's make it happen. Paul and Clara's first step was outreach. They arranged a meeting in the neighborhood selected for the pilot program, inviting community leaders and residents to learn about the project. The turnout was modest, and the skepticism was palpable. What's the catch? One resident asked bluntly. People don't just give away technology like this without expecting something in return. Paul nodded, understanding their concerns. There's no catch. We're not here to exploit anyone. This system is designed to give you control over your energy, no strings attached. Another resident chimed in. And what happens if it breaks? Who's going to fix it? We've seen projects like this come and go, leaving us worse off than before. Paul took a deep breath. I get it. You've been let down before. That's why we're committed to staying involved long-term. We'll train local technicians to maintain the system, so you're not dependent on us or anyone else. The room was quiet, the tension easing slightly. Finally, an older man in the back spoke. If this works, it could change everything for us. I say we give it a shot. His words were met with murmurs of agreement, and Paul felt a flicker of hope. With community buy-in secured, Paul's team began installing the first modular energy systems. The work was grueling. Navigating outdated infrastructure and logistical challenges required constant troubleshooting. But seeing the first system up and running was worth every late night and early morning. Children gathered to watch as the system powered up, the soft hum of stored energy filling the air. It's working, Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe. Paul couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. Just as things seemed to be going smoothly, disaster struck. A sudden storm knocked out the main power grid, and one of the pilot systems malfunctioned under the strain. Paul's phone buzzed relentlessly as reports of the outage poured in. Residents were frustrated, some even angry. I knew this was too good to be true, one man shouted during an emergency meeting. Paul took a deep breath, his mind racing. We'll fix this, he promised. I'll personally make sure every issue is resolved. The pressure was immense, but Paul refused to give up. With his team's help, he spent the next 48 hours troubleshooting and repairing the damaged systems. When the grid came back online and the pilot system stabilized, the relief was overwhelming. At the next community meeting, Paul faced the residents once more. I know we hit a bump in the road, he said, but we learned from it. The system is stronger now because of it, and we're committed to making this work for all of us. To his surprise, the crowd responded with applause. The initial frustration had given way to cautious optimism, and Paul felt a surge of gratitude. Have you ever faced resistance when trying to make a positive change? How did you overcome it? Let us know in the comments. The storm had been a setback, but it also proved something essential, the resilience of Paul's vision. By fixing the system under pressure, he and his team demonstrated their commitment not only to the technology, but also to the people it was designed to serve. Slowly, the skepticism that had defined the project began to melt away, replaced by cautious support and genuine curiosity. 2 weeks after stabilizing the systems, Paul received an email that caught him off guard. It was from Sandra Rodriguez, a local journalist who had attended one of the community meetings. "I've been following your project," her email read, "and I'd love to write a feature about it. I think people need to know how you're tackling the energy gap." Paul hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready for public scrutiny, especially given how fragile the pilot program still felt. But Clara convinced him. "This could be the boost we need," she said. "If people see the potential, it might attract more support." Paul agreed, and a week later, Sandra visited the site with her notepad and camera. She interviewed residents, took pictures of the systems, and listened intently as Paul explained the project's goals and challenges. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. It painted a vivid picture of what the project was achieving and highlighted the lives it was beginning to impact. A few days later, Paul was summoned to Elon's office. He arrived, half expecting criticism for drawing media attention to an experimental project. Instead, Elon held up a copy of the article with a rare smile. "This is good," Elon said, tapping the page. "You're making waves. But now the pressure's on. People are watching, and they'll expect results." Paul nodded. "I understand. We'll deliver." "I know you will," Elon replied. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You've come a long way, Paul. Keep it up." The words, simple as they were, felt like a vote of confidence, a reminder that Paul wasn't just a cog in the machine. With the positive press came new opportunities. Organizations that had previously ignored Paul's outreach now wanted to meet. Investors expressed interest, and local governments reached out, curious about how the project might be adapted for other areas. But scaling up wasn't as simple as adding more systems. Each neighborhood had unique challenges, different grid infrastructures, varying levels of community buy-in, and, in some cases, outright resistance from local utility companies worried about losing control. Paul called for a meeting with his team to strategize. "We need a model that adapts," Clara said. "One size fits all won't work. What if we create modular variations tailored to specific needs?" Another engineer suggested focusing on partnerships with community organizations to streamline installations and build trust. As the team brainstormed, Paul realized something profound. This wasn't just his project anymore. It was a collective effort, with each person bringing ideas and solutions to the table. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Paul decided to visit one of the pilot sites unannounced. The system he had helped install stood quietly in a small yard, its sleek panels catching the fading sunlight. He knocked on the door of the house, and a middle-aged woman answered. "Hi, I'm Paul Winters," he said, feeling slightly awkward. "I just wanted to check in and see how the system is working for you." The woman smiled. "Oh, it's been great. My electricity bill's gone down, and we didn't even lose power during last week's outage. It's a blessing, really." Her words hit Paul harder than he expected. For so long, he had doubted himself, questioned his path. But here, in this modest home, was proof that his work mattered. Back at the lab, Paul stared at the whiteboard filled with notes and diagrams. The pilot program had been a success, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, scaling the project without losing its heart. As he picked up a marker to sketch out the next phase, Paul felt a sense of calm determination. This was more than a job. It was a mission. Have you ever felt like you finally found your purpose? What moment made you realize it? Share your story below. Success brought attention, and with attention came opposition. While many celebrated the pilot program, others saw it as a threat. Utility companies, local politicians, and even some community leaders began to voice concerns, questioning the feasibility and long-term implications of Paul's project. Paul wasn't surprised when Apex Tech, one of the largest utility providers in the area, called a press conference to criticize the initiative. "This so-called energy revolution is unsustainable," their spokesperson declared. "Localized systems might sound appealing, but they undermine the stability of the grid and place undue risks on consumers. Centralized energy systems exist for a reason." The comments stung, but Paul knew they weren't entirely wrong. He had always recognized the challenge of integrating decentralized systems into an aging grid. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Apex Tech's objections were less about practicality and more about protecting their monopoly. A few days later, a local councilman voiced his skepticism during a public forum. "I appreciate the ambition here," he said, "but we need to ask hard questions. What happens when these systems fail? Who will be accountable? And how do we ensure equitable access without government oversight?" Paul decided to attend the next forum in person, despite warnings from Clara and the team. "These aren't easy questions," Paul admitted when it was his turn to speak. "But they're questions we're prepared to answer. This project isn't about replacing the grid. It's about complementing it. It's about giving people options and empowering communities." The councilman seemed unconvinced, but several attendees clapped, showing their support. Tensions also arose within the pilot neighborhood. While many residents appreciated the benefits of the new system, a small but vocal group began raising concerns. "What if they pull out and leave us stuck with broken systems?" one resident asked during a community meeting. Another added, "Why do we always have to be the guinea pigs for these experiments?" Paul listened patiently before responding. "You're right to ask these questions, but we're not here to experiment on you. We're here to build with you. If this system fails, that's on us, not you. And we're committed to making it work." His words eased some of the tension, but Paul knew trust would take time to rebuild. The external pressure began to strain Paul's team as well. "We're doing too much, too fast," one engineer argued during a heated meeting. "We need to slow down and focus on refining the technology before expanding." Clara disagreed. "If we stop now, we lose momentum. People are watching, and they need to see that we're serious about scaling this." Paul found himself caught between two perspectives. He valued caution, but he also understood the importance of keeping the project alive in the public eye. "We'll compromise," he finally said. "We'll expand, but only to one additional site for now. That way, we can test scalability without spreading ourselves too thin." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to keep the team moving forward. As the challenges mounted, Paul sought advice from Elon, whose support had been instrumental in getting the project off the ground. "Adversity is a good sign," Elon said. "If no one's pushing back, it probably means you're not pushing hard enough. But remember, big ideas don't survive without a solid foundation. Focus on the fundamentals, and the rest will follow." Paul left the meeting feeling reinvigorated. Elon's words reminded him of why he had started this journey, to challenge the status quo and make a difference. Determined to counter the opposition, Paul and Clara organized a community showcase to demonstrate the impact of the pilot program. They invited residents, local officials, and media outlets to see the systems in action and hear testimonials from the people using them. One resident, a single mother named Dana, shared her experience. "I used to dread my electric bill every month," she said, holding back tears. "Now, I can actually save money. This program has changed my life." Her words resonated with the audience, and by the end of the event, Paul felt a renewed sense of hope. The opposition wasn't going away, but neither was the support. For every skeptical voice, there was someone like Dana, someone whose life had been transformed by the project. Paul realized that the journey ahead would be harder than he had imagined. But as he stood among the people he was fighting for, he knew it was a fight worth continuing. Have you ever had to defend a vision against overwhelming odds? How did you stay motivated? Share your story below. Expanding the project to a second location was both a bold move and a calculated risk. Paul and his team chose a suburban neighborhood with a mix of middle-class families and low-income residents, a demographic that would test the system's adaptability. But with the new site came new challenges, forcing Paul to navigate uncharted waters and prove the project's scalability. The team spent weeks analyzing potential locations. They settled on a small community called West Ridge, which had recently experienced repeated blackouts due to aging infrastructure. "We're taking a big gamble here," Clara warned during a meeting. "This neighborhood has more stable income levels, but they also have higher expectations. If we stumble, it could hurt us more than help." Paul nodded, acknowledging the risk. "But if we succeed, it'll show that this isn't just a stopgap for underserved areas, it's a viable solution for everyone." Paul and Clara organized a town hall to to introduce the project to West Ridge residents. Unlike the first site, this crowd wasn't skeptical. They were intrigued but had questions about practicality. "How will this affect our property values?" one homeowner asked. "What's the maintenance cost?" another chimed in. Paul answered each question with patience and transparency, emphasizing the potential savings and the long-term benefits of energy independence. By the end of the meeting, most attendees seemed on board, but their cautious optimism was a stark contrast to the desperate hope he'd encountered at the first sight. The comments stung. Paul knew there was truth in the criticism, but it wasn't the whole story. The project was a response to a deeper systemic problem, but explaining that in sound bites was far more complicated. As the criticism intensified, Paul was called into a meeting with his investors, who were starting to express doubts. "We've seen the positive results in the pilot areas, Paul," one of them said, his voice tense. "But now we need to know, can this really scale? Are you sure this is sustainable?" Paul took a deep breath. "I understand the concerns. The systems we're deploying have limitations, but we're working on solutions to address them. We're not just making energy accessible, we're creating a more resilient grid, one community at a time." But as he spoke, he could tell that their confidence was wavering. He needed something more, something concrete to prove that this wasn't just a hopeful project, but a tangible solution to a very real problem. Just when things seemed the most uncertain, Paul received an unexpected call. It was from Sandra Rodriguez, the journalist who had written the first feature on the project. "I've been thinking about your project," Sandra said. "I think it's being misunderstood. It's not about replacing the grid. It's about fixing what's broken. And I want to help you tell that story." Sandra had seen the shift in public sentiment, and she was willing to use her platform to advocate for the project. She promised to write a follow-up piece that would go deeper into the long-term potential of decentralized energy systems and highlight the community impact. A few days later, Paul and Clara faced the investors again, but this time they came prepared. "Here's what we've done so far," Paul began, presenting data from both pilot sites: energy savings, reduction in outages, and the growing number of residents signing up for the program. "This isn't just a trend. It's proof that people want and need alternatives." Clara followed up with a proposal for a phased rollout that included a comprehensive plan for scaling the systems to more regions while maintaining quality and sustainability. One of the investors raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying this is just the beginning?" Paul nodded. "Exactly. If we can prove this model works in a few more communities, we'll be in a position to revolutionize the way people think about energy." The investors exchanged glances. They weren't fully convinced, but there was a shift in their demeanor. The plan was solid. The results were real. It wasn't all just hope and speculation anymore. "We'll give you one more quarter to prove this works on a larger scale," the lead investor said. "But after that, we'll need to see significant expansion." With the pressure mounting, Paul knew he had one last opportunity to prove the system's scalability. He and his team set their sights on the next challenge: expanding into a rural area where infrastructure was even more unreliable and the community had less access to modern resources. "We'll be facing our toughest test yet," Paul said as they began preparations. "But this is it. If we can make this work, the world will see that this is more than a good idea. It's a necessity." The stakes had never been higher. Every failure felt like it could cost everything, but every success brought them closer to changing the future of energy. As the team worked tirelessly, Clara pulled Paul aside one evening. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" she asked quietly. "This could make or break us." Paul looked at the map of their next site. It was a stretch, even for him, but he could feel the weight of the responsibility. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We have to try. For everyone who believes in this." Late one night, after a long day of finalizing the details for the next site, Paul stood alone in the lab, staring at the progress board. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of doubt. Was he in over his head? Had he miscalculated? Could they really change an entire industry? But then he remembered Greg, the father from West Ridge, and the countless other people whose lives had been touched by the system. He remembered why he had started. "We're not doing this for us," Paul whispered to himself. "We're doing this for them." Have you ever faced a moment where everything seemed like it was on the line? How did you push through the doubt? Share your story below. The pressure was building. The investors were getting anxious, the media was watching closely, and the people who believed in the project were counting on Paul to prove that the decentralized energy systems weren't just a pipe dream. This was their chance to prove it wasn't a fluke. Their next challenge, a rural community called Green Valley. Nestled in the hills, far from any major city, Green Valley had long struggled with sporadic power outages, aging infrastructure, and a lack of resources to address their energy needs. It was a community that had seen little investment in modern technology. But if Paul and his team could make this work, it would change everything. Paul, Clara, and the team arrived in Green Valley to find a welcoming yet cautious atmosphere. The town had heard about the project's success in the urban neighborhoods, but there was skepticism. "What makes you think this will work here?" a local farmer named Joe asked when Paul visited his property to discuss the installation. "We're not like the city folks. We don't have the same resources. And we don't trust outsiders trying to sell us ideas that sound too good to be true." Paul understood Joe's wariness. Rural communities often felt neglected by big corporations and government initiatives. The last thing they wanted was to be treated as experimental subjects. "We're not here to sell you anything, Joe," Paul said. "We're here to help, but you're in charge of how it works. This is about giving you control over your energy, so you don't have to worry about power outages and high costs." Joe was silent for a moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but I'm watching closely. You mess this up, and we're done." Paul could only hope he would come through for Joe and the rest of the community. The technical challenges in Green Valley were immense. The area's grid was patchwork at best: old lines, unreliable transformers, and homes with outdated wiring. Each home required a unique solution. The team had to think creatively to retrofit the decentralized systems to work with the existing infrastructure. "This isn't going to be easy," one of the engineers admitted after several setbacks during the installation. "The systems are more complicated than we thought, but we can make it work." Paul spent hours on site, making sure the team had everything they needed to push forward. He knew that failure wasn't an option, not after everything they had been through. To introduce the project to the rest of the community, Paul and Clara held a town meeting in the local school gymnasium. The turnout was better than expected, but the mood was still cautious. Green Valley wasn't used to outsiders coming in with promises. "We're not here to make any grand promises," Paul began, addressing the room. "We're here to help solve a problem. You've had enough outages, and your bills have gone up every year. This project isn't a silver bullet, but it's a start. A way to take control of your own energy." A few people in the back muttered, but most were listening. When the meeting ended, several residents approached Paul with questions. Some were curious, others still unsure. But it was a step forward. As installation continued, things didn't go as smoothly as expected. The rural terrain proved to be a bigger challenge than anticipated, with harsh weather and difficult access to some of the homes. "We've got to adapt, or we're going to fall behind," Clara said, frustration in her voice. "If we don't finish these installations soon, we'll lose the trust of the community." Paul felt the weight of those words. They were behind schedule, and the town's patience was wearing thin. Residents had started questioning the system's reliability, and a few had begun pulling out of the project. "Let's hold on a little longer," Paul urged the team. "We've been through tougher times. We can still make this work." Then, just when it seemed like everything might fall apart, something shifted. The team made a breakthrough with the integration of the new systems, and the first few homes started showing significant improvements. The energy efficiency was higher than expected, and the power outages were down to near zero. The people of Green Valley began to notice. When Joe, the farmer who had initially been so skeptical, saw how well the system was working at his farm, he was stunned. "I don't know what to say," Joe admitted, standing on his porch as he watched his energy monitor showing a steady supply of power. "I didn't think this could happen here. I guess I owe you an apology." Paul smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "No apologies needed, Joe. This is about making things work for you. We're all in this together." With the first few successes under their belt, the momentum began to build. More residents signed up for the system, and the mood in Green Valley shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. During a follow-up meeting, the mayor stood up and addressed the crowd. "We were doubtful, but I think it's safe to say that this project is making a difference. I don't know if this is the future of energy, but it's certainly a big part of it. Let's see where it goes. Paul looked around the room, at the faces of people who had once been uncertain, but were now beginning to believe in the potential of what they had built. Green Valley became a model for other rural areas, showing that the decentralized system could work even in the most challenging conditions. Word spread to neighboring towns, and soon other communities reached out, asking to join the program. But Paul knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was ensuring that the systems would remain sustainable, even as they expanded. Still, for the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment to relax and appreciate what they had accomplished. What's the most difficult challenge you've faced, and how did you overcome it? Share your story in the comments. The success of Green Valley was a pivotal moment for Paul and his team. They had proven that their system could work in rural areas, a crucial step towards scaling the project to larger regions. But success came with its own set of challenges. As attention turned toward the project's potential, the stakes got higher, and the pressure to keep expanding was relentless. With word of mouth spreading throughout nearby communities, Paul's project began to attract interest from larger municipalities. It wasn't just about the rural towns anymore. Cities were calling. "Paul, we've been hearing a lot about your project," said Greg Walsh, a city councilman from a neighboring metropolis. "We've got serious issues with our grid, and we're looking for something different. Your decentralized systems, can you make it work here?" The question hung in the air. Paul had spent the last several months focusing on small, rural communities, where the systems had been relatively easier to deploy. But the cities, large, densely populated, with complex infrastructure, would be an entirely different beast. "I believe we can," Paul replied, trying to sound confident. "It might take some time to adapt, but I think it's the solution we need. Not just for rural areas, but for cities too." Paul and Clara traveled to the city to conduct a feasibility study. The grid was older than they expected, with power lines crisscrossing neighborhoods and aging infrastructure that had been neglected for decades. "This is a far cry from Green Valley," Clara said as they toured the downtown area. "This will require more than just solar panels. It's going to need integration with the existing grid, and we're going to have to deal with local utilities that might not be too happy about this project." She was right. The utilities had a monopoly on the area, and Paul knew they would not welcome the competition. But the more he saw the suffering caused by the old grid, the more determined he became. He couldn't let the fear of confrontation stop him from moving forward. Paul quickly realized that the project would need more than technical solutions. It would need political support. And that meant navigating the complex web of city politics. At a meeting with the mayor and the city council, the room was tense. Several council members were skeptical, concerned about the potential pushback from the utilities and the cost of implementing the new system. "We can't afford another failure," one of the council members said, glancing at Paul. "This city has been through too many failed projects. Why should we believe this is any different?" Paul stood his ground. "We've already proven that this system works. The problem is, the grid has been outdated for far too long. We're not trying to replace it. We're trying to make it work better for everyone. This is a chance to modernize and build a more sustainable future." The council was hesitant, but Paul could see a few members softening. He knew he needed to prove that the project wasn't just about technology. It was about the people it could help. Just as things seemed to be hitting a wall, a surprising ally emerged. Sarah Liu, a high-ranking executive at the local utility company. Sarah had been watching Paul's project from afar, and after seeing the success in Green Valley, she reached out to Paul with an offer to collaborate. "I know the company I work for has a lot of concerns about this technology," Sarah said over the phone, "but I also see the potential. I think we can find a way to integrate your systems with our grid, rather than compete with us. There's a way forward here that doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing fight." Paul was shocked by the offer. He had assumed the utilities would fight him at every turn, but Sarah's willingness to collaborate changed everything. It opened the door to a new approach, one that could bring both the decentralized systems and the existing grid together. "We'll need to meet and discuss this further," Paul said, "but I think this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." In the weeks that followed, Paul and Sarah worked together to develop a pilot program that would test how the decentralized systems could be integrated with the city's existing grid. The project would focus on neighborhoods that were particularly prone to blackouts and those with high energy costs. Clara remained cautious. This is a huge step. If we can make this work, it could change the entire energy landscape. But if it fails, I know, Paul said. But this is our chance to prove that decentralized energy is the future. Not just for rural towns, but for cities too. We have to take the risk. As the pilot program began, the first signs of success were promising. The systems were able to reduce blackouts and lower costs for residents. But the true test would come in the months ahead, when the scale of the program grew and the pressure mounted. As the project expanded, the media started to take notice. Stories about the city's new energy initiative spread quickly, and soon, Paul was featured in interviews and news segments across the country. He was being hailed as an innovator, a pioneer who was changing the way the world thought about energy. But with the praise came even more scrutiny. You've been successful in rural areas, but can you really make this work in a major city? One journalist asked during an interview. What about the costs? What about the integration challenges? It's one thing to work on a small scale, but what happens when you're talking about thousands of homes? Paul answered as confidently as he could, but the doubts were beginning to creep in. A few months into the pilot program, things finally started to click. The integration between the decentralized systems and the grid was working better than anyone had anticipated. The city saw a significant reduction in energy waste, and the residents were paying less for their energy bills. Looks like you were right, Sarah said during a meeting with Paul. The system is working. It's not perfect, but it's better than anything we've seen in years. For the first time in a long while, Paul allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. This could work. But as they celebrated their success, Paul knew the hardest part was yet to come, scaling the project even further. Have you ever had to prove yourself when everyone doubted you? What did it take to overcome the challenges? Share your thoughts below. After months of progress, it seemed like Paul's dream was finally within reach. The decentralized energy systems were beginning to make a significant impact, and the first major city project was showing signs of success. But even as the systems began to work in the city, something else was brewing in the background, something that threatened to derail everything Paul had worked for. It was late one evening when the first signs of trouble appeared. Paul was at his desk, reviewing the latest data reports when his phone rang. It was Clara. "Paul, you need to see this," she said, her voice strained. "What's going on?" "It's the Green Valley system. There's been a massive failure in the main grid," Clara explained. "The solar storage units are down, and we're seeing a ripple effect. Other towns using the same model are experiencing the same issues." Paul's heart sank. He had known this risk was always a possibility, but hearing it happen was another matter entirely. Green Valley had been their proving ground, and if it failed, everything they had worked for could come crashing down. "I'm on my way," Paul said, grabbing his coat and heading out the door. Arriving in Green Valley, Paul saw the problem firsthand. Residents were without power, and some homes were reporting electrical surges that had damaged appliances. The decentralized energy system that had worked so well in the beginning was now the source of frustration and fear for the community. Paul met with the local team in Green Valley, trying to assess the situation. Clara was already on the phone with engineers, attempting to diagnose the cause of the failure. "We need to identify the root cause of the system failure," Clara said, frustration evident in her voice. "If we don't, this could spiral into something worse. The trust we've built here will vanish overnight." Paul nodded, trying to hold back his panic. This was more than just a technical issue. It was a test of his leadership. "We'll fix this," Paul said, trying to reassure everyone around him. "We've come this far. We've overcome worse. Let's do what we do best." But deep down, Paul knew this could be the end of everything. Days turned into weeks as Paul and his team scrambled to fix the issue in Green Valley. The cause of the failure was traced to a flaw in the software that controlled the integration between the solar panels and the energy storage units. A faulty algorithm had caused overloading in the system during periods of high energy demand, resulting in the outages and damage to appliances. "The system wasn't designed to handle this level of usage," Clara explained. "We need to reprogram the entire platform, but it's going to take time." As Paul and Clara worked to fix the issues, the pressure mounted. The media had caught wind of the problems in Green Valley, and the negative headlines began to spread. The excitement surrounding the project began to fade, replaced by skepticism and doubt. After weeks of hard work, the team finally patched the issues and got the system back online. But it was clear that Green Valley wasn't the only place where things were fragile. Investors began to pull back, uncertain about the reliability of the system. The media coverage of the failure had turned public opinion, and Paul felt like he was fighting a losing battle. At a board meeting with the investors, the mood was tense. "Paul, we're seeing serious issues with reliability," one investor said, his tone critical. "We can't afford another failure like this. If we want to expand this system nationwide, we need assurances that this won't happen again." Paul tried to remain calm. He knew that what they had built was revolutionary, but it was still a work in progress. "We're addressing the issue," Paul said, his voice firm. "The failure was a result of an isolated flaw, and we've already implemented the fix. It won't happen again." But the investors weren't convinced. "This is the kind of setback that can sink a project," another investor remarked. "You've lost credibility, Paul. The next time something like this happens, we won't be here to bail you out." The tension was also building between Paul and Clara. Clara had been by his side from the very beginning, but she was becoming more frustrated with the constant setbacks. She had always been the practical one, the voice of reason in the chaos. But lately, her patience was wearing thin. "We're running out of time, Paul," Clara said one evening, sitting down with him in the quiet office after a long day. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this going. There are too many people depending on us now. If we don't get this right, we lose everything. Not just the project, but the trust we've worked so hard to build." Paul looked at Clara, understanding her frustration. He had always known that the road ahead would be difficult, but the weight of failure was heavier than he had anticipated. "I know," Paul said quietly, "but we can't give up. This is too important. Not just for us, but for the people who are depending on us to change the way they live." Clara didn't respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll follow you. But we need to make some serious decisions, and we need to make them fast." With Clara's support, Paul doubled down on fixing the issues and gaining back the trust of their investors and the public. They implemented new safety measures in the system, revamped their software, and began a nationwide campaign to reassure potential customers that the project was back on track. Slowly, the momentum began to shift. The negative headlines were replaced by stories about how the project was adapting and evolving. Green Valley, once the site of failure, became the symbol of resilience, showcasing how setbacks could lead to breakthroughs. Weeks later, the system was fully operational again, and the results spoke for themselves. Green Valley was back online, and the decentralized energy systems were working better than ever. Paul had made tough choices, and they were paying off. The project was rebounding, slowly but surely. At a small celebration in Green Valley, the town's residents gathered to thank Paul and the team for their dedication. "You did it, Joe," the skeptical farmer said with a smile. "You fixed it. And now we're saving money, and we've got power when we need it." Paul smiled, finally feeling the relief of success once again. But he knew this victory was only temporary. The true test would come when the system expanded even further, and the challenges would only grow. Have you ever faced a setback that made you question everything? How did you push through? Let us know in the comments. As Green Valley's system was fully restored and running smoothly, Paul felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that the setbacks were not just obstacles to overcome but opportunities to refine their approach. The success of the recovery, however, only brought him temporary relief. With each new challenge, the stakes continued to climb. Paul had always envisioned his project scaling far beyond rural towns. The system that had worked in Green Valley and other small communities could potentially change the way energy was consumed across the globe. But the next phase of the project would demand more than just fixing glitches and securing a few investor assurances. They needed to prove that the systems could thrive under more pressure when the spotlight was brightest. With Green Valley back on track, Paul received an unexpected call from Sarah Lou at the utility company. "Paul, I've been thinking," she said. "I know we've been working together to integrate the systems in the city, but I think it's time we go public. It's time to take this to the next level, showcase that the system can be part of the solution for urban areas, not just rural ones." Let's see if we can turn this around. Paul's heart skipped a beat. Going public was a huge risk. He knew it would put the project under a microscope, and any failure at this stage would be disastrous. But there was a part of him, an optimistic part, that believed in the project's potential. We can do it, Paul replied. Let's set it up. We need to show the world that this technology works, not just in small towns, but everywhere. A few weeks later, the stage was set for a press conference that would introduce the revamped energy system to the city. It was a pivotal moment, a chance to turn the tide, to show the world that their technology was no longer a risky experiment, but a viable solution for modern cities. The room was packed with reporters, energy industry leaders, and city officials. Paul stood in front of the podium, with Clara and Sarah by his side, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. This is the beginning of something bigger than any of us, Paul said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. We've spent months perfecting a system that can decentralize energy production, bringing power directly to where it's needed most. The challenges we've faced have only made us more determined to build a future where energy isn't just about profit, it's about people. As he spoke, Paul could feel the skepticism in the room. They weren't just listening to his words, they were looking for cracks, for evidence that the technology couldn't deliver. And Paul knew that one misstep, one failure, could undo everything they had worked for. But as the press conference went on, the tension began to melt away. The demonstration of the new system, its efficiency, its ability to balance power loads during peak times, was a success. The journalists began to ask more questions, but these were questions of curiosity, not doubt. It was a breakthrough. But as Paul would soon realize, the true test had just begun. Despite the success of the press conference, the lingering doubts from investors were still a problem. They were cautious, waiting to see if the system would hold up under the pressure of a full-scale rollout. During a board meeting, one of the investors, Michael Harris, voiced the concerns of the entire group. This is still a pilot project, Paul. You've shown us a working model, but we haven't seen this system scale properly. If you're going to push forward, we need more than promises. We need data. We need proof. Paul felt the weight of the room on him. He had promised results, and now, the room was waiting for him to deliver. I understand, Paul said, his voice calm but resolute. We've only begun to scratch the surface, but I can assure you, this technology is the future of energy. We're already seeing its impact in Green Valley and in the city. The next step is to expand, refine, and prove that it can work on a larger scale. It was a tough crowd, but Paul knew he had no choice but to push ahead. He couldn't afford to fail now, not when so many people were depending on him. Just as Paul began to feel the pressure mounting, an unexpected opportunity arose. An international energy conference, one of the largest in the world, announced that it was looking for innovative energy solutions to showcase. Paul's team was invited to present their decentralized system as part of a global demonstration of sustainable energy technologies. This was the chance Paul had been waiting for. A global stage to show that their system could work not just in one city, but across the world. The risks were enormous. If they failed, the world would see. But if they succeeded, it could change everything. We need to get this right, Clara said as she and Paul discussed their presentation plans. This is our shot to prove that we're more than just a local solution. We're talking about an international audience here. Paul agreed. The stakes couldn't have been higher. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. The setbacks were just the beginning. Now was the time to prove that they could scale, that they could meet the global demand for sustainable energy. The energy conference was everything Paul had hoped for, and more. As he took the stage and presented the system to an international audience, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were captivated by the idea of decentralizing energy, of giving communities control over their own power. The technology was more than just a solution, it was a vision for the future. But as the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse, Paul felt the weight of the responsibility that still lay ahead. The system was generating excitement, but the next step was to prove that it could handle the immense pressure of scaling to an international level. Back home, the team began working around the clock to prepare for the expansion. With the success of the conference, they now had the financial backing and the political support they needed to push forward. The next step was clear. expand the pilot programs to multiple cities across the country, testing the system in diverse environments and ensuring it could handle the different demands. But the path forward was never going to be easy. They had to contend with regulatory hurdles, infrastructure challenges, and the constant pressure of managing expectations. Still, with the global attention, the momentum was on their side. As Paul looked out over the city from his office, he knew that the real journey had just begun. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken? Do you think it paid off, or did it fall short? Let us know in the comments. As the dust from the international conference settled, Paul's team plunged into action, working at a feverish pace to prepare for the upcoming expansion. With the system's success now recognized on a global scale, there was no turning back. However, with this newfound attention came new pressures. The expectation to scale quickly and efficiently was enormous, and every misstep carried the potential to undo months of hard work. Paul had spent years building this vision, but now he had to balance ambition with caution. The first wave of expansion took place in 3 major cities across the country, each one presenting its own unique set of challenges. The decentralized energy systems were designed to adapt to various infrastructures, but the sheer complexity of integration meant that there were constant hurdles. For every breakthrough, there were multiple setbacks. Paul found himself working longer hours than ever before, constantly on the phone with engineers, city planners, and investors. His role had shifted from visionary leader to crisis manager. Every issue that arose felt like a direct threat to the reputation they had worked so hard to build. As much as Paul tried to stay positive, the constant demands began to take a toll. He was tired, physically and emotionally drained. The weight of his responsibility was becoming heavier by the day. He had a team that depended on him, investors who were watching every move, and the world waiting to see if their decentralized energy system could truly succeed on a large scale. The breaking point came when the new systems in 2 of the cities failed to perform as expected. A particularly harsh winter storm caused unexpected outages, and the energy storage units in some neighborhoods began to malfunction. The power was down for several days in parts of the city, and the backlash from residents and local government was swift. "It's happening again," Clara said, her voice laced with frustration. "We thought we had accounted for everything, but this storm, it's exposing weaknesses we hadn't anticipated." Paul stared at the reports in front of him, his mind racing. The setbacks felt all too familiar, but this time, the stakes were much higher. This wasn't just a small town anymore. It was the heart of the country's energy future. If they couldn't fix this, they'd lose everything, every investor, every partner, every piece of trust they had earned. "We'll get it fixed," Paul said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He tried to believe it. He had to, but deep down, he knew that something bigger had to change. The systems they were working with were powerful, but they weren't invincible. To move forward, they needed to rethink their entire approach to scaling. As the issues continued to mount, Paul made the difficult decision to pause the expansion temporarily. This decision sent shockwaves through the company, particularly among the investors who had placed their faith and their money into the future of the project. Michael Harris, the lead investor, was one of the first to react. "Paul, this is unacceptable. We've given you the resources to make this work, and now you're telling us we have to stop? You've set expectations for the future of this company. This pause, this delay, could ruin everything." Paul could feel the pressure mounting. The idea of halting progress was terrifying, but he also knew that they couldn't afford another mistake. He needed time to reassess, to fix the issues at their core. "I understand," Paul said, his voice firm, "but if we don't take the time to fix this now, the consequences will be far worse in the long run. I'm not giving up. I'm making sure that when we move forward again, it's with the right foundation." The decision was a gamble. Paul had no way of knowing how the investors or the public would react, but it was the only way forward if he wanted to ensure the success of the project in the long term. After the decision was made, Paul took a step back and allowed himself a moment of reflection. He visited the original Green Valley system, the place where it all began. It felt surreal, standing there, looking at the small town where they had tested the first version of the energy system. "What do we do now, Clara?" Paul asked, his voice heavy. "We've come so far, but it feels like we're right back where we started." Clara, ever the realist, sat beside him. You've built something incredible, Paul. We've learned more than anyone else in the industry. Maybe this setback is exactly what we needed to do it right. Sometimes, you have to step back to move forward. This isn't the end. It's just a recalibration. Paul took a deep breath, her words offering some solace. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he also understood that their work wasn't just about technology. It was about creating a legacy that would transform the way people lived. He couldn't let this setback define them. As Paul and his team worked to fix the flaws in the system, they also began the process of rebuilding trust. They held meetings with investors, explaining the steps they were taking to ensure the systems would work under extreme conditions. They launched an outreach program to the cities affected by the outages, offering compensation and personalized support to restore faith in the project. Through this period of rebuilding, Paul came to understand the importance of not just technology but also human connection. It wasn't enough to create a sustainable energy system. They needed to prove that they were just as committed to the people who relied on it. With Clara's support, Paul refocused the team on their mission, to create an energy system that didn't just power homes, but empowered people. They began to see improvements as new safety protocols were implemented, and systems were optimized for different climates. It was slow work, but it was progress. After months of repairs and fine-tuning, the system was finally ready to be tested again on a larger scale. As Paul prepared for the next phase of the project, he knew the risks were still high. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. The next city was ready to go live with the system, and the feedback from the residents was overwhelmingly positive. The energy was consistent, the technology was running smoothly, and the new protocols had proven successful under difficult conditions. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And for Paul, that was enough. He had learned that progress wasn't linear. It was a series of setbacks and comebacks, of facing adversity and finding a way to overcome it. As he watched the new system come online in the city, he knew that this was just the beginning. When have you been faced with a major setback, and how did you bounce back? Share your story in the comments below. After months of hard work, Paul and his team finally began to see the fruits of their labor. The new systems, now functioning as they had intended, were rolling out to cities across the country. The feedback was positive, and the energy technology that had once seemed like an untested experiment was finally beginning to find its place in the world. However, with success came an entirely new set of challenges. The successful implementation in cities had created a sense of optimism within the team, but there were still major hurdles to overcome. The true test, Paul knew, would be in scaling the project to a global level. Green Valley had been the proof of concept, but now it was time to go big, to show that their decentralized energy solution could work for entire countries, not just a handful of towns. Paul sat at his desk, reviewing the numbers. The growth was incredible, but the speed of expansion meant they would need more resources, more engineers, more support, and more political backing. The task ahead was daunting. Yet in the face of these challenges, Paul felt a spark of excitement. "I think we can do this," he said to Clara, who had been by his side through every step of the journey. "But it's going to take everything we have." Clara smiled. "When has that ever stopped us?" Despite their success, Paul and Clara knew they had to secure one more major partnership, the government. Without political support, they wouldn't be able to navigate the complex regulatory landscapes of different countries. And so, they arranged a meeting with some key political figures and energy regulators to discuss the future of their decentralized energy solution. Sitting in a polished conference room, Paul felt the weight of the moment. The people in the room were powerful, the type of individuals who could make or break a project of this scale. There was a chance, just a chance, that if they could convince these leaders, they could change the trajectory of the entire energy industry. "Gentlemen and ladies," Paul began, standing before the large table, "what we are proposing is not just a new energy solution, it's a transformation in how we think about and use power. Our decentralized system can reduce dependency on centralized grids, minimize outages, and create more sustainable, local energy solutions for cities around the world." One of the regulators, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. "And you believe that this can be done at a global level?" she asked. "We've already proven it in cities across the country," Paul replied. "The technology works." What we need now is the support to help us scale it, to make sure we can create a more resilient energy future for everyone. The meeting stretched on for hours, with questions flying at Paul from every direction. Regulations, safety concerns, scalability. There were a dozen hurdles to clear. But Paul and Clara answered every question, explaining the intricate details of their technology, showing how they had accounted for potential risks and pitfalls. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted. What had started as skepticism was slowly transforming into cautious optimism. They were close, so close to securing the partnership that could make their global expansion a reality. A week later, Paul received the call he had been waiting for. The government had agreed to partner with them. It wasn't a blanket endorsement, but it was a huge step forward. They would begin with pilot programs in several key cities worldwide, supported by government incentives. The relief that flooded Paul was overwhelming. They were on the edge of achieving something that could change the energy landscape forever. But as always, there were new obstacles waiting in the wings. With the political backing secured, Paul and his team began preparing for the next phase, scaling to a global stage. The first international pilot program would launch in Europe, where demand for sustainable energy was high. The program was set to go live in just 6 months, but as the deadline drew closer, Paul realized that they had more to do than simply roll out the system. They had to be ready for anything. The media, investors, and governments were watching closely. The stakes were higher than ever before. The slightest misstep could undo everything. Paul spent sleepless nights in meetings with engineers, troubleshooting every possible failure, every potential risk. They were pushing the limits of their technology, and there was no room for error. But Paul knew that failure wasn't an option. This was his moment. This was the time to prove that what they had created was not just a solution, but a revolution. The day of the launch arrived with a mix of excitement and tension. The pilot program was set to go live in 2 cities, one in the north and one in the south. Each would face different challenges due to local geography, energy demands, and existing infrastructure. As the system began powering up in the first city, Paul watched from his office. The screen in front of him showed data. Everything was running smoothly. There were no outages, no unexpected errors. The system was performing flawlessly, and for the first time in months, Paul allowed himself a deep breath. But the real test was yet to come. As the program continued to expand, Paul knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. They needed constant monitoring, constant adjustments. Every success felt like a victory, but every small failure could cost them dearly. Just as things seemed to be going smoothly, a major problem occurred in the southern city. A malfunction in one of the energy storage units caused a ripple effect that threatened to destabilize the entire system. Paul's heart sank. He had hoped that this moment, the global launch, would be flawless, but it was clear they still had vulnerabilities. Clara was already on the phone with the engineering team, walking them through a potential solution. "We can fix this," Clara said, trying to reassure Paul. "We just need to isolate the issue and reroute the power. We've handled worse." But for Paul, it wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about proving to the world that their technology was resilient, that it could withstand the pressure of a global rollout. The eyes of the world were upon them, and this failure could threaten everything. As the team worked quickly to resolve the issue, Paul paced back and forth. He knew that this was the true test of their system, how they handled the challenges when everything seemed to be on the line. Hours later, the crisis was averted. The issue had been fixed, and the system was back online. The damage was minimal, and the recovery time had been faster than anticipated. Paul allowed himself a sigh of relief. This was what success looked like, navigating through the storms, emerging stronger each time. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for Paul, that was enough. He had always known that scaling the system would be a challenge. But with every problem they overcame, they were one step closer to achieving something truly groundbreaking. Have you ever faced a moment when everything seemed to be on the line? How did you rise to the challenge? Let us know in the comments below. The crisis in the southern city had been a close call, but Paul knew that this was just the beginning. They had passed the first major test, and the world was watching. With the global pilot program officially launched, the energy solution that once seemed like a distant dream was now a reality in several cities worldwide. The question was no longer if the system would work, but whether it could be scaled quickly enough to meet the soaring demand for sustainable energy. In the weeks that followed, the news spread like wildfire. Articles, interviews, and features flooded the media, each one highlighting the innovative solution that Paul and his team had developed. Green Valley was no longer just a small-town initiative. It was now a household name, synonymous with the future of energy. The demand for the decentralized system soared. Cities across Europe, Asia, and North America began to express interest in implementing the technology. Paul received calls from high-ranking government officials, energy companies, and even other tech giants looking to partner with them. But with this newfound attention came increased scrutiny. People wanted answers. How could they scale this effectively? Was the system truly sustainable? Could it handle the needs of entire countries? These were questions Paul and his team had been preparing for, but the pressure was undeniable. Every success felt like it was building up to an even greater challenge. Despite the success, not everyone was convinced. Michael Harris, the lead investor who had supported Paul from the beginning, was cautiously optimistic. However, the pressure to perform was beginning to show. "Paul, we've come a long way, but scaling globally is another beast altogether," Michael said in their latest meeting. "The numbers are impressive, but we need guarantees. Investors want to see more than just potential, they want concrete results." Paul knew the risks. They were already pushing the limits of the technology, and while the pilot programs had been successful, the complexities of scaling to a global level could unravel everything. It wasn't just about building the system. It was about proving to the world that this was the solution to the energy crisis, a solution that could work everywhere, not just in ideal conditions. "Michael, I hear you," Paul said, pacing the room. "But if we don't take this step now, someone else will. We have the technology, the infrastructure, and the backing. We're at the edge of a major shift in the energy industry, and we can't afford to hesitate." Michael looked at Paul, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not saying don't move forward. I'm saying you need to be prepared. We need backup plans, contingencies, and more robust data on how the system will adapt to different environments. The world is watching, Paul. One failure could destroy everything." Paul nodded. He understood the stakes. It wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about the future. And the future was now. As the months passed, the challenges only grew more complex. The team worked tirelessly to meet the growing demand, but there was always something else to address. New cities wanted the system. New governments needed assurances. Investors wanted faster returns. The team barely had time to breathe, let alone reflect on how far they had come. Paul found himself on the phone every hour of the day, responding to requests, managing crises, and still trying to steer the ship in the right direction. It was Clara who first noticed the toll it was taking on him. One evening, after another long day filled with meetings, Clara sat him down. "Paul, I know this is huge. I know you're carrying the weight of this project, but you need to step back for a moment. You can't do this alone." Paul met her gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. "I can't stop now, Clara. This is everything we've worked for. If we don't keep pushing, if we don't scale this right now, we'll lose our chance. Everything we've done so far could fall apart." Clara nodded, but there was concern in her eyes. "I get it, I do. But we can't afford to burn out. You need to take a break, even if it's just for a day. It's not just your company. You've got people who care about you." Paul sighed. He knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he wasn't pushing every moment, he'd miss something crucial. Still, Clara's words lingered in his mind, reminding him of the importance of balance. For the first time in months, Paul took a weekend off. It wasn't much, just a couple of days away from the constant barrage of calls and emails. He spent the time in Green Valley, where it all began. It was quiet there, peaceful, and for a moment, Paul felt like he could breathe again. Walking through the town, he was struck by how much it had changed. The energy system they had created was now a part of daily life for everyone who lived there. Homes were powered by sustainable, local energy, and the town itself had become a model for other cities around the world. He stopped in front of one of the original houses that had been part of the pilot program. The family who had lived there when they first started were still in the house, and they waved when they saw him. "Thank you," the woman said, smiling as she approached. "This system, it's changed everything for us." We don't worry about power outages anymore. It's so much more reliable, and we're paying less. It's a game changer." Paul's heart swelled with pride. This was why he had pushed so hard. This was why he had sacrificed so much. He had helped create something that was not only changing lives, but also transforming the world. As he sat on the porch, looking out over the town, Paul realized something. The future wasn't just about energy, it was about the people. The goal had always been to provide sustainable energy, but in that moment, he saw that the real impact was in the way it empowered communities. It was about giving people control over their energy and, ultimately, their lives. With a renewed sense of purpose, Paul headed back to the city, ready to face the next phase of the project. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now he had a clearer vision of what he was working toward. It wasn't just about making a profit, proving a concept, or gaining accolades. It was about creating a world where people could live freely, without the constant worry of energy scarcity. And that, Paul realized, was worth every sacrifice. Have you ever taken a step back to gain a new perspective on a project or a life decision? How did it help you move forward? Share your experience below. The success in Green Valley and the subsequent global rollout of the energy system marked a pivotal moment for Paul and his team. With the world now paying attention, their decentralized energy solution had become not just a technological innovation, but a symbol of progress. The key question, however, remained. Could they maintain momentum on a global scale while staying true to their original vision? As new cities across the globe began implementing the technology, the effects rippled outward, creating a wave of change in communities that had once been dependent on traditional power sources. The energy independence they had achieved was revolutionary. No longer were they at the mercy of large utility companies or fossil fuel-driven power plants. People were in control of their own energy futures. In the weeks after the program's launch, the feedback from citizens was overwhelmingly positive. Families were saving money on energy bills, small businesses had reliable power, and the fear of blackouts was becoming a thing of the past. For Paul, seeing the transformation in the lives of everyday people was incredibly gratifying. But he knew this was only the beginning. The political and financial pressure to scale quickly was mounting, and with every success came even higher stakes. The media continued to report on the success of the system, but with the increased attention came more scrutiny. Questions of whether the technology could handle diverse climates, unpredictable weather, and the technical complexity of maintaining such a large-scale operation loomed large. The world was watching, and critics were waiting for any sign of weakness. Investors, too, were keeping a sharp eye on the numbers, with some wondering if the rapid expansion could lead to unanticipated challenges. There was still the matter of ensuring that the system could be maintained and operated seamlessly across continents, each with its own unique infrastructure and energy needs. Paul and Clara were on a constant loop of meetings, refining the strategy and preparing for the next phase of scaling. Yet, despite the challenges, they remained determined. The technology had already proven itself in multiple cities. Now it was time to prove that they could maintain that success across vastly different landscapes. One of the most complex challenges was navigating the political terrain. While many governments were eager to adopt the energy system, there were those who were wary. Traditional energy sectors, especially those tied to fossil fuels, were powerful, and they weren't keen on seeing an alternative energy solution thrive. In particular, Paul's team faced resistance in several countries that had a heavy reliance on coal or oil. The political influence of these industries made it difficult to negotiate deals or gain the necessary permits to implement their systems. Paul had always known that this would be one of the hardest hurdles. But the success stories from countries that had embraced the technology were beginning to break down some of the resistance. As more cities saw the economic and environmental benefits, pressure mounted on governments to reconsider their stance. "We need to make it clear that we're not here to replace traditional energy," Clara advised during a strategy meeting. "We're here to complement it, to offer alternatives. The world isn't going to stop using fossil fuels overnight, but we can provide a more sustainable option in the meantime." Paul nodded. They needed to shift the narrative from being a threat to the existing order to becoming part of a necessary evolution. With strategic partnerships and lobbying efforts, they began to build bridges with the policymakers who had been hesitant at first. Slowly, the resistance began to crumble. Then came the breakthrough Paul had been waiting for. A key endorsement from one of the world's largest international organizations, a group focused on climate change and sustainable development. The endorsement was a game changer, providing the credibility and legitimacy that governments and investors needed to fully back the project. It was a defining moment for Paul. The organization not only praised the technological innovation, but also highlighted its potential to help meet global climate goals. The media frenzy that followed was intense, and suddenly, the pressure they had been facing seemed to lift, at least for a moment. The international community had spoken. This was the future of energy. With the political and media landscape shifting in their favor, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. But it wasn't just about surviving the political battles or winning over investors. It was about making a lasting impact. The mission had always been bigger than profit or recognition. It was about creating a sustainable, resilient energy future for the world. As the rollout continued, Paul expanded his vision. The energy system wasn't just for cities. It could also serve rural areas, which had long been neglected by centralized power grids. There was potential to transform even the most remote, underdeveloped parts of the world, places where access to electricity had been limited or unreliable. "We're not just building infrastructure," Paul told his team one evening. "We're building hope. We're empowering people, giving them the tools to thrive, to control their own futures." The global expansion continued to exceed expectations, but there were still challenges to be overcome. Now, Paul and Clara had to address the next frontier: the integration of renewable energy sources like solar and wind into their decentralized grid. The technology could handle power generated from these sources, but optimizing and balancing the load required new innovations. They began working with leading experts in the renewable energy sector to develop solutions that would allow the system to take full advantage of the resources available in each region. This included energy storage technologies that would allow for excess power to be saved for later use and improved efficiency in harnessing natural resources. They also began exploring the integration of artificial intelligence to better predict energy demand and optimize distribution. With AI, the system could anticipate power shortages or surpluses and adjust in real time, making it more reliable and adaptable than ever before. The road ahead was long and filled with unknowns, but the path was clear. The world was changing, and Paul's team was at the forefront of that change. They had created something that had the potential to redefine how the world thought about energy, and with every new breakthrough, every success, they were proving that the impossible was possible. As Paul looked back on the journey, he realized that the true power of their work wasn't just in the technology. It was in the connections they had made. From the engineers and scientists who helped bring the system to life to the families in Green Valley who had been the first to benefit from it, Paul understood that their success had been a collective effort. They had created something greater than themselves. And as the world continued to change, Paul knew one thing for certain: their work wasn't just about building energy systems. It was about building a better world, one where people could thrive, regardless of where they lived or what challenges they faced. What's the most significant change you've seen in your community over the years? How has technology or innovation impacted your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As Paul's energy system continued to expand across the globe, the world seemed to be on the cusp of a new era of sustainability and self-reliance. However, with the rapid expansion came unforeseen consequences, both personal and professional, that Paul had not anticipated. Though the recognition was sweet, the weight of responsibility was heavier than Paul had ever imagined. Every day brought new challenges, and each success only raised the stakes higher. As the leader of this monumental project, he was constantly scrutinized by the media, investors, and governments. No decision he made seemed small, and no problem seemed simple. His phone rang incessantly, filled with urgent calls from partners, potential clients, and even detractors who were keen to find any flaws in the system. As the pressure mounted, Paul found it harder to stay focused on the vision that had driven him in the first place. Late one night, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Paul sat in his office, staring at the plans for the next phase of the project. He could see the road ahead, but it seemed impossibly long. Clara, always a steady presence by his side, knocked softly on the door before entering. She could see the toll it was taking on him. "Paul, you've been at this for hours," she said gently. You need rest. You can't lead if you're running on empty. Paul looked up at her, his eyes tired but filled with determination. I know, Clara, but I can't stop. We're so close. The system is working. We're changing the world, and I can't afford to drop the ball now. Clara sat down beside him, her voice soft but firm. I understand the mission, but I'm worried about you. We've built this together, and we need you to be at your best. This isn't just about the energy system. It's about your life, too. Paul sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right, but the idea of stepping back, even just for a moment, felt impossible. Every hour counted, and every decision had the potential to shape the future of the project. As the project grew, so did the distance between Paul and those closest to him. He had always been driven by a sense of purpose, but that drive had led him to sacrifice the things that once mattered most: his health, his relationships, and the balance in his life. Clara had been his constant, supporting him through the highs and lows. Yet even she had begun to feel the strain. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Clara admitted one evening. It feels like I'm losing you. We're both drowning in this. It's all-consuming. Paul looked at her, the pain in her eyes mirroring the exhaustion he felt. He reached out, taking her hand. I don't want to lose you, Clara, but I can't walk away from this now. She squeezed his hand but pulled it away. I know you can't, but what happens when you lose everything else? Is it worth it? The conversation lingered in the air, unresolved. Paul didn't have an answer. He had never imagined that success could come with such a price. Despite the overwhelming success of the energy system, Paul began to face increasing criticism. Some of the very cities that had initially embraced the technology were now experiencing issues that hadn't been anticipated. In colder climates, for instance, the decentralized grid was struggling to meet the high demand for heating during the winter months. The system had been designed to handle a variety of environmental conditions, but the intense cold in some areas had highlighted weaknesses that Paul and his team had not foreseen. Local governments were quick to point fingers. The press picked up on the stories, amplifying every flaw, no matter how small. Headlines screamed about glitches and unforeseen failures, putting pressure on Paul to fix problems faster than they could arise. Though the system's overall success was undeniable, Paul knew that these issues had to be addressed quickly, or the entire project could be at risk. As more criticism piled on, Paul's confidence began to waver. Could they truly scale this technology to meet the needs of a diverse global population? Or had they stretched themselves too thin, too quickly? It was during one particularly difficult week, when both internal and external pressures were mounting, that Paul found himself at a crossroads. A critical meeting with the United Nations Energy Council was scheduled, and the stakes were higher than ever. This was the moment he had been working for, the chance to secure funding and political support on a global scale. But as he reviewed the data and projections, doubts began to creep in. Was it time to slow down? Was the world ready for the massive, rapid deployment they had planned? Or was this all too much too soon? As Paul stood in front of the UN representatives, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He had spent so much time trying to prove that his system could change the world. But now, in this moment, he realized that the world needed to change first. People needed to be ready for the technology. Governments needed to prioritize sustainability and invest in the infrastructure that would support these systems. Without that groundwork, no amount of technology would make a difference. I'm proud of what we've built, Paul said in the meeting, his voice steady. But I want to be clear, this isn't just about pushing out more technology. It's about fostering a global shift in how we think about energy and the environment. We need to invest in people, in communities, in education, and in long-term sustainability. The technology is just the beginning. The real change comes when we all commit to this together. His words hung in the air. The room was silent for a moment, as if everyone was processing what he had said. Finally, a representative from the council spoke. Mr. Turner, we appreciate your vision. And we agree. This isn't just about the system. It's about the world coming together to make it work. Let's work on making that happen. In the days that followed, Paul began to see things differently. The project wasn't just his responsibility, it was a shared mission. He no longer needed to carry the weight alone. And with that realization, he began to make space for those around him, trusting the team he had built to help shoulder the load. He called Clara, asking her to meet him in the city. When she arrived, he sat down beside her, a sense of calm in his eyes. "I'm sorry for pushing you away," he said. "For making you feel like this was something I had to do alone. I need you. We need each other." Clara smiled softly, her hand reaching for his. "We're in this together, Paul. Always have been." And for the first time in a long while, Paul felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew that no matter how difficult the journey, he wouldn't have to face it alone. Have you ever faced a turning point in your life when you realized that slowing down or asking for help was the right choice? How did it change your perspective? Share your story below. The global expansion was accelerating, but Paul soon realized that the very success they had achieved was creating an unforeseen and deeply troubling issue: trust. While the energy system itself was groundbreaking, the way it was implemented, and its rapid rollout, had started to generate skepticism, particularly among the public. What had begun as a hopeful and revolutionary project was now facing its greatest test: whether the world still believed in it. At first, the criticism had been manageable. It was natural for a project of such scale to face challenges. But as the months went by, the stakes became higher, and the cracks in the system began to widen. There were new reports of data breaches, issues with local governments in certain countries, and a troubling series of technical malfunctions that no one had expected. The energy system, which had seemed so promising, was being scrutinized in ways that hadn't been anticipated. Cities and countries were pulling back from their initial support, worried about the long-term viability of the solution. Governments were reluctant to invest further without clearer guarantees of its reliability. Investors, once eager to pour billions into the project, now hesitated, questioning whether the future of the system was truly secure. To make matters worse, rumors were circulating about possible safety concerns, even though there was no conclusive evidence to support them. But perception was often more powerful than reality, and the public was beginning to lose confidence. One morning, as Paul entered the office, he found Clara sitting at her desk, her face pale. She handed him a stack of papers, news articles, internal reports, and emails from investors. "You need to see this," she said quietly. Paul scanned the documents, his heart sinking. The headlines were filled with alarming language: energy revolution at risk, system failures leave cities in the dark, tech giants under fire for incomplete rollouts. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara sighed deeply. "The backlash is growing. Some of our key partnerships are starting to question the feasibility of the whole project. Some cities are calling for investigations into the system's failure rates. It's like everything is unraveling all at once." Paul stared at the papers for a long moment. The weight of it all hit him harder than any technical failure could. This wasn't just about a broken machine or a malfunctioning grid. This was about trust, the trust they had built with the public, the governments, and the world. He knew how critical trust was to the success of the project. Without it, everything they had worked for would collapse. A few days later, the public protests began. Groups formed in the streets of major cities, calling for transparency, accountability, and solutions. The energy system had been hailed as the savior of the future, but now it was being blamed for the new failures that had begun to surface. In some cases, people were even accusing Paul and his team of lying about the capabilities of the technology, accusing them of rushing into implementation without proper testing. Social media was flooded with angry posts, questioning whether the technology was worth the risk. "If the world can't trust you with energy, what can they trust you with?" one viral post read. At the height of the backlash, an investigative journalist released a detailed report that raised concerns about the company's internal communications, alleging that some of the flaws in the system had been ignored or downplayed during development. The report fueled further distrust, and soon, Paul was facing calls for resignations, regulatory inquiries, and even a potential class action lawsuit from consumers in affected cities. In the midst of this chaos, Paul struggled with a dilemma. Should he step forward and take full responsibility, or distance himself from the fallout and allow others to handle it? There was a growing chorus of critics who said that leadership was about accountability, and Paul was the face of the project. He would either sink or swim with it. Clara could see the internal battle within him. "You've always been the one who believed in this," she said one evening, as they sat in their office after hours. "But you have to decide now whether you're going to lead us through this crisis or let it overwhelm you." Paul looked at her, feeling a mix of guilt and frustration. "I don't know if I can do this. People trusted us, and I feel like I've let them down." Clara's gaze softened. "You didn't let anyone down, Paul. The system works. Yes, there are issues. But you've always said this wasn't about perfection. It's about progress. And right now, that's exactly what we need to focus on. Progress, not perfection." That night, Paul made a decision. He would not run away from the crisis. He would confront it head-on. The next day, he called an emergency press conference, determined to speak directly to the public and the world. Standing before the cameras, Paul took a deep breath. He had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. "We know that the technology we've developed isn't perfect," Paul began, his voice steady. "We've made mistakes, and we've faced setbacks. But I want to be clear. We are committed to fixing these issues, and we will do everything in our power to restore the trust that has been lost." He continued, speaking openly about the failures, acknowledging the gaps in the system, and offering a plan of action. "This is not the end of the journey. It's a turning point. We will implement immediate improvements, work with independent auditors, and ensure that our technology meets the highest standards. We will be transparent with every step of the way." The press conference had an immediate effect. While many remained skeptical, there was also a sense of relief among the public. Paul's honesty and willingness to confront the problem directly began to shift the narrative. The next few weeks were crucial. The team worked tirelessly to address the technical failures, while also ramping up communication with affected communities. Slowly but surely, confidence in the project began to rebuild. The media, while still critical, acknowledged Paul's willingness to take accountability and the genuine efforts being made to fix the system. Investors, too, began to reconsider, seeing that Paul and his team were not backing down from the challenge. But the journey was far from over. The road to regaining full trust would take time, and Paul knew that this was only the first of many obstacles. Yet, as he stood with his team, addressing each issue with transparency and dedication, he realized that rebuilding trust, though difficult, was possible. Paul had learned an invaluable lesson. Leadership wasn't just about vision or innovation, it was about trust. True leadership meant standing firm in the face of adversity, owning up to mistakes, and working relentlessly to make things right. And now, with a renewed sense of purpose, he was ready to lead his team through the most difficult chapter of their journey yet. Have you ever been in a situation where trust was broken? How did you rebuild it? Share your thoughts with us below. The road to redemption had been long and fraught with challenges, but after months of hard work, transparency, and dedication, Paul stood at the precipice of a new beginning. The energy system was no longer just a revolutionary idea. It had become a symbol of resilience, innovation, and hope. And now, as the project was back on track, Paul found himself facing a question he had never anticipated. What comes next? It had been 6 months since the crisis. The immediate technical issues had been resolved, the public perception had shifted, and the trust that had been broken was slowly but surely being rebuilt. People were starting to see the potential of the energy system once again, not as a perfect solution, but as a living, evolving technology that had faced setbacks and emerged stronger for it. Paul had spent countless hours on the ground, meeting with city leaders, engineers, and communities that had been most affected. He had listened to their concerns, shared in their frustrations, and offered solutions. He had become more than just the leader of a company. He had become an advocate for the very people his technology was meant to serve. Yet, despite the outward success, Paul knew that the battle for the system's long-term success wasn't over. There were still regulatory hurdles to clear, partnerships to strengthen, and new markets to enter. The world was not waiting, and the technology had to evolve to meet its needs. In the midst of the rebuilding phase, a new opportunity emerged. A group of international leaders approached Paul with an ambitious proposal to scale the energy system on a global level, focusing on developing countries that lacked access to reliable electricity. These regions had been neglected for decades, and now, the energy system that Paul had pioneered could provide a lifeline. The proposal was groundbreaking, but it also came with its own set of challenges. It wasn't just about providing energy, it was about creating sustainable infrastructure, educating local communities, and training the next generation of engineers and technicians. It was a bold vision, one that would require Paul and his team to think beyond their current model. "I never thought I'd see this day," Paul said to Clara, as they reviewed the proposal together. "This system has the potential to change the world in ways we hadn't even imagined. But it's going to take everything we have to make it happen." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with the same determination that had fueled their journey from the start. "We've already done the impossible once. Now, we have the chance to do it again. And this time, we do it with purpose." As the project expanded, Paul felt the weight of leadership in a new way. His role had always been about making bold decisions, but now it was about something deeper, ensuring that the technology they were deploying was not just solving problems, but enriching lives. The success of the project had never been just about the money or the accolades. It was about the people it impacted. With this new perspective, Paul made a conscious decision to shift his focus from the day-to-day operations to the bigger picture. He began to spend more time with his team, mentoring young engineers, fostering innovation, and nurturing the company's culture. And as he did, he found himself reconnecting with the things that had brought him joy before all the chaos: the thrill of discovery, the satisfaction of teaching, and the deep sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he was making a difference. Clara had always been by his side, but now she had her own role to play, supporting him not only as a partner but as a leader in her own right. They were no longer just a couple trying to change the world. They were a team, each bringing their unique strengths to the table. As the energy system took root in developing countries, the impact was immediate. Rural communities that had never seen reliable electricity began to flourish. Hospitals were powered, schools were illuminated, and businesses began to thrive. The hope that Paul had once had for the project was now being realized on a global scale. The ripple effect went beyond just energy access. With electricity came education, opportunity, and new possibilities for generations to come. People in these communities had long been told that they were too far from civilization to benefit from the progress of the modern world. Now, they were beginning to prove everyone wrong. "I think we've finally reached the turning point," Clara said one night, as they watched footage of a small village in Africa, now powered by the energy system. "This isn't just about technology anymore. It's about human potential." Paul nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride and satisfaction. "It's a new dawn. And it's just the beginning." Despite the progress they had made, the path forward was not without its challenges. The energy system had to continue evolving, adapting to new environments, and addressing the challenges of scaling up. And now, Paul had to make a decision. Would he continue to lead this global movement, or would he step back and allow someone else to take the reins? The decision was not easy. He had dedicated his life to this cause, but he knew that leadership was about more than just holding on to power. It was about knowing when to let go. One evening, sitting in his office, Paul reflected on everything that had brought him here. The road had been long and difficult, filled with setbacks and triumphs, moments of doubt and moments of clarity. But through it all, he had learned one thing above all else. Leadership was not about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the one who could inspire others to find their own voice. "I think it's time," he said to Clara, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time for someone else to take the lead. I've given everything I have to this project, but now it's their turn." Clara smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've built something that will last, and you've built it with love, dedication, and integrity. Now, let them carry it forward." Paul's decision to step down from the day-to-day leadership of the company was met with mixed reactions, but it was the right one. He had given the world something far more important than a groundbreaking technology. He had given them a vision, a movement that would outlast any one individual. Years later, as Paul watched from the sidelines, he saw the next generation of leaders taking the project to new heights, solving problems that he could never have anticipated. And in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to reflect, he knew that he had done something that would change the world forever. His legacy wasn't just the energy system. It was the hope that people, when united by a common goal, could overcome any obstacle. What does leadership mean to you? How do you know when it's time to step forward? and when it's time to step back? Share your thoughts with us below.